Marcus considered himself a pragmatist, a man of logic, not folklore. So when he checked into the dusty, faded glory of the Grandview Hotel and the concierge paled at his room number, he scoffed. "Don't you know about room 13, sir?" the old man whispered, his eyes wide. "They say it's where the screams live." Marcus just laughed, grabbing his key and heading for the elevator. He would prove the old man wrong. He was tired, and the promise of a good night's sleep was far more appealing than any ghost story. Room 13 was exactly as he expected, a time capsule of bad taste. The wallpaper was peeling, the bedspread was a faded floral print, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and neglect. Nothing out of the ordinary, he thought, tossing his bag onto the bed. He went to the window to draw the curtains, and that's when he felt it for the first time. It wasn't a sound, but a pressure. A deep, bone-vibrating thrum that seemed to fill the room, pushing in on him from every direction. It was like standing in front of a bass speaker, with the volume on full. But with no music, he froze, his hand on the curtain. The pressure intensified, and he felt a strange, sympathetic ache in his jaw, as if he himself were clenching his teeth against some unimaginable force. He shook his head, convincing himself it was a boiler or a faulty ventilation system. He pulled the curtains shut and lay on the bed, but the feeling remained. It was a silent scream, a physical echo of pure, unadulterated terror. As the night wore on, the silent screams became more pronounced. They started to affect his vision. The corners of the room seemed to warp and shimmer, the lines of the dresser and chair wavering as if being viewed through heat haze. He felt a phantom burning sensation in his throat, and his eyes began to water. The pressure grew, a crescendo of pure anguish that threatened to burst his eardrums, despite the total silence. He tried to speak, to call for help, but his mouth wouldn't move, and he realized with a horrifying clarity that the screams were not just a presence in the room, they were the room. Driven by a primal fear, he stumbled towards the door, his movements sluggish and heavy as if moving through water. He was halfway across the floor when he saw it. In a brief, agonizing instant, the room's geometry fractured, and he was no longer in a hotel room. He was in a small, dark closet. Before him stood a woman, her mouth open in a perfect, impossible circle of silent terror. Her hands were pressed against her ears, her body shaking as if every muscle were a live wire. And then, he saw it. A shadow, not like a person, but like a shifting cloud of pure blackness, consuming her from the feet up. She was being erased, and her silent, body-shaking scream was all that was left. He felt the same pressure on his feet, the same cold, creeping nothingness. The woman's face, a contorted mask of horror, was the last thing he saw before the silent screams took him. He tried to cry out, but only a deep, vibrating thrum came from his throat. Marcus had not proved the old man wrong. He had just become another part of the silent, agonized symphony of room 13. Elias first saw the grinning man in the rearview mirror of his car. It wasn't a man, not really, but a distortion of his own face, a fleeting, nightmarish parody of a smile stretched impossibly wide from ear to ear. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his own exhausted reflection. He shook it off, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of a mind overtired from late night work. But the grin came back. It appeared in the polished chrome of an elevator door, in the reflection of a dark storefront window, and in the glass of a coffee shop. It was never a full figure, just the face, always in the reflection of his own, hovering a foot behind his shoulder. The grin was the constant, a thin, lipless line that seemed to promise a silent, unending cruelty. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of pure, malicious glee. Soon, Elias was living in a world of constant vigilance. He started walking with his head down, avoiding eye contact with any reflective surface. He'd duck his head in department stores, and take the stairs instead of the elevator. His apartment became a bunker. He covered the television screen with a blanket and draped all the mirrors with old sheets. He even started using his phone with the screen dimmed to the lowest setting, terrified of seeing that familiar face appear behind his own, mocking him. The terror reached a new level when he saw it in the reflection of someone else. He was walking down a crowded street when he glanced at a woman's sunglasses. For a split second, he saw himself looking over her shoulder, and the grinning man was there, grinning back at him from her reflection. It was no longer bound to his own reflection. It was everywhere. It was in the world now, and it was getting closer. The final descent happened on a night of pouring rain. The power had gone out, and Elias was sitting in the pitch-black living room, surrounded by his covered mirrors, feeling a rare moment of peace. He'd made it. He'd outsmarted the grin. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the large window across the room. For a fraction of a second, he saw the window as a mirror. He saw his own terrified face, and right behind it, bathed in the pale light of the lightning, the grinning man. But this time, it wasn't a reflection. It was a silhouette standing just on the other side of the glass, a gaunt, dark figure with a grin that filled the whole pane. And then, the voice came. It was not a whisper or a hiss, but a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to come from inside the house, from behind the walls, from inside his own head. "You can't cover your skin," the voice rumbled. Elias froze. He saw his hand, pale in the residual light, and watched in horror as the back of his hand began to wrinkle and pull tight, the skin stretching into a new, impossibly wide shape. He felt his own cheeks pull back, his lips separate, as a grin of his own began to form. The grinning man wasn't a shadow or a reflection. He was a possession, a slow-growing cancer on the soul, and he had finally broken through. Elias was now the grinning man, and he was already looking for a new reflection. Leo had always found a strange comfort in the dark, but the darkness in his new house was different. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was an entity. It had a presence, a weight, and most unnervingly, a voice. At first, it was a faint, almost imperceptible rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a wooden floor. He'd write it off as the old house settling, a trick of the wind, or his own imagination. But as the weeks bled into a cold, unending autumn, the rustling solidified into a distinct whisper. It was always just out of reach, a sound that seemed to curl around the corners of his vision. When he was in the kitchen, it would murmur from the dining room. When he was in bed, it would breathe just outside his door. The whispers weren't words at first, just an ebb and flow of sound that felt like a secret told to a crowd. They were a constant, eerie companion, a soundtrack to his slow descent into paranoia. One night, the whispers changed. He was in the living room, trying to read by the firelight, when a shadow detached itself from the wall beside the fireplace. It wasn't a human shape, just a denser patch of blackness, a deeper void within the already dim room. It glided across the floor, slow and deliberate, and settled on the armchair opposite him. The whispering intensified, now a frantic hiss, a sound of desperation and anger. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. The shadow didn't move. It simply sat there, a silent, malevolent guest. From that moment on, the shadows were no longer just patches of darkness. They were sentient things. They clung to the corners of the ceiling, pulled under the furniture, and writhed at the edges of his vision. They no longer whispered from a distance. Now, they were right beside him. The whispers began to form words, fragmented and broken at first. "Help us," they would hiss from the staircase. "Get out." A chorus would groan from the shadows in his bedroom closet. Their forms became more defined. He saw a shape like a long, thin finger slide under his door, and a distorted, squatting figure cower in the corner of his laundry room. They mimicked him. When he walked, they would slink along the floor behind him. When he stood still, they would converge, forming a huddle of shadows at his feet. The night of the storm, the power went out. The house was plunged into total darkness, and the whispers became a cacophony. He could feel them all around him, pulling at the air, suffocating the space. He heard a door upstairs slam shut, and the distinct thud of something heavy falling down the stairs. The whispers were no longer pleas, they were screams. And among the screams, one voice rose above the rest. It was a woman's voice, sharp and terrified, and it screamed his name. "Leo, help me, the shadows are coming." But the whispers weren't coming for her, they were already there. He lit a match, and in the sudden flare of light, he saw it. The woman was not a ghost. She was a wisp of a shadow, a fleeting, desperate image projected onto the dust in the air. Her eyes were to pinpricks of light, and she was clawing at her own form, trying to escape from a blackness that was consuming her. And then, he understood, the whispers weren't a warning. They were a plea for release. The shadows weren't trying to get in, they were already trapped. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by a malevolent darkness that consumed souls, leaving only their whispered echoes to haunt the halls. And the screams weren't the echoes of her death. They were the echoes of her terror, as she was absorbed into the void. He dropped the match, and the darkness rushed to meet him. The screams intensified, 1,000 voices crying out his name. He felt a cold, crushing weight on his chest, and his body began to dissolve into pure, unadulterated blackness. He was not a human anymore. He was just another part of the house, a new whisper, a new shadow, forever trapped.